Okay. I see some people still streaming in, but we're going to at least start the introduction. Good evening. Thank you for being here tonight at New Canaan Library. First, a little housekeeping. Let's take a moment to silence our cell phones. If you could do that now, and while you're silencing your cell phone, just take note of the exits from this room. So when you leave tonight, after visiting the book table, you can exit directly from either side or go back out same way you came in. Okay. Well, tonight we are very pleased to welcome author Christopher Gorham to talk about his latest book, Matisse at War, Art and Resistance in Nazi-Occupied France. Maybe some of you were surprised. I was surprised to learn of this book because in my mind, Matisse had been kind of in this box. I knew Matisse as, you know, obviously the very famous painter, artist who straddled 19th and 20th centuries, was hugely important in the development of modern art, and those timeless images, so gorgeous, of his interiors, always with windows, and those dancing nudes and the cutouts. And then I had thought, well, that's the story of Matisse, is that body of work. And then Christopher Gorham challenged that and took Matisse out of that box for me and put him in a completely different context, which is World War II and the resistance in France. But new perspectives are nothing new for Gorham. His last book, which some of you may know, titled The Confidante, the untold story of the woman who helped win World War II and shape modern America, tells the story of Anna Marie Rosenberg, whose influence on American history from the New Deal to the Cold War and beyond had never been told before he told it. It was widely praised, and the book received a glowing review in the Wall Street Journal, which wrote about the biography as, quote, a mystery. How could we have forgotten such a woman? And they further extolled Gorham by saying that he resurrected the history, quote, with cinematic color and encyclopedic clarity. Now he's doing it again with another blend of history that reads like a war novel. It's a fascinating story, and I'm not going to take up any more time because I want him to have all the time in the world to tell it. And we're going to start first, before Christopher takes the stage, we're going to start with a video. Okay, now please help me welcome Christopher Gorham.
Thank you. As we enter this season of Thanksgiving, some things to be thankful for. The sunshine today returned, which was nice. Also thankful for Mickey's wonderful introduction, and Eve from Elm Street Books over here. We have a nice big stack of books. Should we run out, you're more than welcome to place an order with her. I'm thankful for her being here as well. I'm also thankful to be part of the ecosystem that is publishing today. It's certainly not just the author. It's a whole team of people that get together and make a product that's readable, that you can pick up on the train or on the airport and enjoy. And someone who's a big part of my ecosystem is here with us tonight, and she's a hometown girl. Ann Pryor, if you would just stand up just ever so briefly. Ann Pryor of Kensington Publishing there. Really, there is no Matisse at War without Ann's help and the ecosystem at Kensington and Citadel that put this together. So thank you. Much to be thankful for. Marc Chagall grew up in Russia, and he said of his hometown, he said it was all the color of a potato. Now, Henri Matisse, of course, is French, and if you've been to France, La Belle France, there's not many towns and villages that are the color of a potato, but Matisse's hometown is one. It was up in the north on the Belgian border, cold and wet and dreary. And it was also Matisse's misfortune to be born in a hometown that if you were Bismarck, or if you were the Kaiser, or if you were Adolf Hitler, and you had designs on invading France, you would go right through this town. And that's indeed what is going to happen. It was also Matisse's rather misfortune to be born at a time in 1869 that would make him an infant when the first of 3 wars broke out in his lifetime. He was just 1 year old when the Franco-Prussian War broke out. When he was a boy, he heard stories of his mother saying that they had to bury the family valuables in the backyard in the garden. When he was in primary school, he heard stories of Parisians surviving, on starvation rations. And as a schoolboy, they would sing songs about being children in a frontier town born to the smell of gunpowder. The Franco-Prussian War would not be the last war to intrude on the life of Henri Matisse. When he was a young man, Matisse trained as a lawyer with all that connotes, the respect for rules, respect for law, respect for reason. And it was a bout of appendicitis that changed the trajectory of his life. He was sick in bed, and his mother brought him a box of paints. And he said, once I held those box of paints in my hand, I knew that my life had changed. He wanted to pursue art. But he was already a little bit later to pursuing an art career than his contemporaries, who might have been starting to draw or paint as very young children. And his art career started slowly. At one point, he was hired at an hourly basis to paint the gilding in a grand exhibition hall. And when he was a struggling artist at the beginning of his career, he was also teaching young painters how to paint. And his message to them was one that he abided by for his entire career. It was this: don't talk about your art. Don't try to verbalize it. Don't try to explain it with words. Let your art do the talking for itself. And that was something that he held to during his entire long career. When he was nearly 30, he met Amélie Pereire, a woman from a proud Toulouse family, anti-monarchical, anti-Bonapartist. This was a progressive family. And so the young man who trained as a lawyer and was now a painter is married to a woman from this progressive family, and they shared values in many ways. But it wasn't until 1905 that Matisse gained fame with this painting behind me. Woman with a Hat was a painting of a riot of color. The ear is tomato red, the forehead has stripes of green. Some of it seemed to the people that saw it as if the paint had come straight out of the tube. This painting made Matisse, Henri Matisse, the leader of the so-called fauves, the wild beast of French painting. and it was exhibited at the same exhibition hall where he'd once painted the gilding. He was now a world-famous artist. Critics asked him, they looked at this painting, some people loved it, but most people were just kind of shocked by the brightness and the vibrancy. One of the critics said, "Well, what color was your wife's hat?" And Matisse said, "It was black, of course." Henri and Amélie had 3 children. Marguerite was from a relationship that Matisse had had with another woman, but Amélie adopted her and raised her as her own daughter. She was the muse of Matisse as a girl. So many paintings, the exhibition that just closed in Paris, so many moving paintings. Marguerite sleeping, Marguerite reading, and on and on. As she was an adolescent and a teen, she was a studio kid. You know, she was hanging out in the studio and washing the brushes and stretching the canvases. And later, she became the studio manager. So after her mother sort of stepped away from being the studio manager, it was Marguerite who became the studio manager, interfacing with collectors like the Steins and the Cohn sisters of Baltimore. Her brother Pierre up there was the second son. He tried violin, he tried painting, and like all 3 of the Matisse children, they all harbored ideas of having a creative career, but they found that their surname was as much a burden as it was a blessing. Marguerite said, "We were a family of artists." Matisse was 44 years old when the Second War intruded on his life, the Great War, War of 1914 to 1918. He wanted to join the trenches with other painters that he knew, who were, a lot of them, younger than him. Charles Canaan was one, and there were many others. He wanted to get in the trenches and fight for his country, but he was too old. He appealed the decision to a government minister, and the minister wrote back and said, "What you can do is continue to paint well." And I don't think we can understand his work in the Second World War during the occupation without looking at some of his works from the First World War. This one, the piano lesson, very, very different than, say, Woman with a Hat. Gone are the bright, vibrant colors and the shapes, the arabesques and the curves. In its place are moodier colors, battleship gray, there's moody blues, there's dark colors. This is a painting of his son Pierre, the one with the violin, who at this point in 1916 is almost old enough to be drafted in the French army. But he's pictured here as a boy, and he's behind a piano. And the critics saw this and they said, well, this is a meditation on Matisse as a father. He's from the north, he's economical with his words, he can be very stern. His son is kept safe by the piano. His son is kept on task by the piano teacher on the high stool. And his son is further kept on task by the iron scroll work that keeps him from going out in the garden, that triangle of green, and playing. But I would invite you to think about this painting a different way from 1916, a painting in which Matisse portrays his son as a boy when his son is really almost old enough to be drafted. Think of it as the piano is safeguarding him, keeping Pierre safe. The scroll work is keeping him protected, and the piano teacher is a guardian. And moreover, there's a metronome on the piano, and the metronome is going tick, tick, tick. Because with every hour that passes, every week that passes, his sons get older and old enough to be drafted. And that's just what happened. In 1917, his eldest son, Jean, was drafted as an army mechanic. His son, Jean, was good with his hands. He was the one that is going to become a sculptor. His son, Pierre, ran away at age 18 to join the French army just in time for the Second Battle of the Marne. And again, Matisse continues to paint well, continues to use his line and his color and his shape as a way to express his feelings. To the small extent that he talked about his own art, that's what he said. He said, that's what my art is. It's to express my feelings, my emotions in line and color. Look at this. This is also from World War I. Bathers by a river, now at the Chicago Institute of Art. The figures are wraith-like. They're almost extraterrestrial. In one, the head is cut off at the top, and another, the feet are cut off at the bottom. And you have this really beautiful verdant green on the left-hand side and a very fetching blue on the right-hand panel. But to get from there to there, you have to cross through this impassable trench, this black maw. This painting confounded collectors and critics when it came out during the First World War. But it was decades later, people started looking at this painting and others like it, like the piano lesson anew, saying, wow, Matisse painted these at a time when his two sons were in the French army. He was worried about whether they'd make it, whether his country would make it. And that gives us a new, fresh look at some of these works. Matisse, as you already know, and many of you probably knew coming in, was not one to sit on his laurels, rest on his laurels. He was one that would take artistic gambles and pivots, from Fauvism to that kind of cubism almost in the piano lesson. In the interwar years, the years between 1918 and 1939, a 2-decade span, he took another artistic pivot. And it was in part because of where he was living. He adopted Nice in the southeastern corner of France on the Mediterranean Sea as his adopted city. He went there for the light, which is otherworldly. Hilary Sperling said, it was a laboratory for someone to create the future. If you were a colorist, the light is so otherworldly there. It was perfect for him. But it was also a time when his family was drifting apart. His wife, Amélie, beset by depression and illness. She'd long since was no longer the studio manager. She'd given that up to her daughter. She was not in great shape. His daughter Marguerite, was now married and living with her husband and starting her own life. So she wasn't there either. His one son, Pierre, the one with the violin, the one in the piano lesson, had to move to New York because he had a spectacularly brief failed marriage to a Corsican woman. And when that marriage blew up, his father-in-law was so angry that he was chasing Pierre around Southern Europe with a pistol. So Pierre went to New York and stayed there essentially for the rest of his life, becoming an internationally known gallerist on 57th Street, a champion of modern art. His other son, Jean, was oftentimes, Matisse didn't know where he was. He wasn't a correspondent, and he was just kind of itinerant around France. And so the family hires an assistant to help with Amélie. This is in Nice. And to care for Matisse's ill wife. And her name was Lydia Delectorskaya. And at first, Matisse referred to her, if at all, very nastily. He said at one point, "She's the Russian help for my wife," which is a terrible thing to say. And then one day in 1935, he looked at her while she was working, and he said, "Hold it right there." And he took out his sketchbook. And that sketch became a painting, The Blue Eyes, one of the most famous Matisse works. And Lydia Delectorskaya is going to become the woman who becomes the studio manager, the muse and the model for Matisse during these years, 1935 to the end of his life. The interwar years in Nice was also a time of when Matisse had lost his edge as an avant-garde artist, according to the critics. No longer, he'd been lapped by the surrealist, he'd been overcome by the cubist, and his subject matter, if you look, it's violin cases and flower vases and models in couture and window after window after window. What was he looking for with these artistic pivots? One critic very nastily said, "Who needs another Matisse window?" And when Virginia Woolf's nephew met him, he said, "Well, he looks like he could be an insurance salesman or a real estate executive. He doesn't look like an artist. He looks like a well-tailored, well-fed bourgeois." The dissolution of Matisse's family unit that he needed to create coincided, and the dissolution of his reputation as an avant-garde artist coincided with the rise of the European dictators. Mussolini in 1925, Hitler in 1933, and Franco in 1937. And it was Mussolini who struck fear into Matisse's heart. In letters to his son Pierre in New York, he would say, "Hey, we are in the line of Benito Mussolini, Il Duce. He wants Nice," because Nice, of course, was Nizza. It was an Italian city that had been the birthplace of the Italian hero Garibaldi. So Nice is not only, a lot of critics at the time said, well, Matisse has just given up. He's this bourgeois guy, he's well-fed, he's down in Nice, the prodigious wonders of that paradise. Well, not so fast. Nice was, in line to be attacked by the Italian fascists, and also perhaps in line to be attacked by Nazi Germany down the road. And this was not lost on the Niçois, and it wasn't lost on Matisse. Nizza o morte, said the Italians, Nice or death. In 1937, one of the European fascists opened a front on the cultural war. Nazi Germany engineered an exhibition of modern art, including Picasso, including Matisse, including Jewish artists, German Jewish artists who are not German, but whose art somehow insulted German feeling, the so-called degenerate art exhibition. Works were torn off of their home museums and put in this traveling exhibition with placards that invited the viewers to mock and to jeer at this art, and Matisse's works were included. It was all done under the idea of Volksgemeinschaft, the idea of cultural and ethnic, racial purity. That was one of the backbones of the German fascist movement. And so in 1937-38, Henri Matisse finds himself an enemy of the German state. And, should Germany take over other parts of Europe, well, Henri Matisse is going to be an enemy of those areas as well. In September of 1939, the Cultural War became the military war when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Parisians knew they were at some point going to be next, whether it was the next month or whether it was 3 months later, but Parisians fled in the millions, and thinking that Germany is going to attack any moment. And the Culture and Art magazine editor, a man named Thériault, who was a friend of Matisse, asked Matisse to do the cover of the magazine that was coming out at this time in August 1939. And this is what Matisse did. The fleur-de-lis, the ancient and enduring symbol of France. But because he's Matisse, it has to be in so many colors that Thériault had to run it through the printing press 26 times. And the background is a foreboding black. Thériault saw this and he raced to that printing press to get it printed in time. It was printed on the eve of September 1st, 1939. So if you woke up on that day and bought a copy of Verve, that was the day that World War II started. Matisse, again, telling his emotions through his art, through his line, through his color. Matisse had many opportunities to leave. In fact, artists of all stripes, composers, poets, writers, whether they were French, whether they were living in France, took opportunity to get on the fastest steamer out of town, or get to Lisbon, or get out of there. And, in some cases, if you were Marc Chagall, you were Jewish, it was a matter of life and death. Matisse was given many opportunities to leave. His son had a job lined up for him at Mills College in Oakland, California. He had a visa for Rio de Janeiro in his breast pocket. He had people saying to him, you are, a cultural giant of France. You're an older man. You're not in the best of health. You should leave. And he likened it to desertion. He said to his son, what if everyone of value leaves, what will become of France? And so he defiantly remained in a France that was in the sights of Nazi Germany. The Germans struck France in May and June of 1940, and it was over within a matter of weeks. The Panzer divisions cut France in half. It was such a shocking victory that one of Pierre Matisse's friends likened it to a puzzle that had been swept from the tabletop onto the floor. People didn't know where Picasso was. Is he in Paris? Is he in the South? Is he in France? People didn't, the international press briefly lost sight of Matisse. Is he alive? Is he dead? And if so, where is he? Well, he was alive, it turns out, but just barely. Since the late 1930s, he'd suffered this debilitating stomach ailment. And in early 1941, while he was in Nice, it became so bad that his daughter Marguerite had to come down and fetch him to take him toward the demarcation line, toward the German occupation, which was in the north of France. That was German occupied. Southern France was a collaboration estate called Vichy. Marguerite had to take Matisse and Lydia, they weren't good friends, had to take Matisse up to Lyon for emergency surgery, which turned into 2 surgeries, which then led to an infection, and Matisse drifted between life and death for over a week. By the spring of 1941, he was better. He was good enough to at least stand up and go out and walk in the garden outside the clinic, and the nurses at the clinic called him the resuscitated one. Paris under the swastika, meanwhile, was a place of deep cynicism. The Matisses that had been taken off the wall as degenerate had been put in a dark storeroom, but there were other Matisses that either could be part of a high-ranking Nazi's own art collection, or it could be used as a bargaining chip to get, an old master that one of these guys fancied. And so you see this incredibly cynical photograph here. The man at the bottom left, of course, is Hermann Goering, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich. And he's at the Jeu de Paume Art Museum in Paris ogling two Matisses, the very same person that his regime labeled a degenerate artist. And it didn't matter to Goering that Matisse's collectors were the Steins or the Cohns or other Jewish collectors. 5 or 6 Matisses wound their way into the personal collection of Hermann Goering. Matisse's own collection of art, his own personal collection, he had Cézanne's, he had his own art, was stored in a Parisian bank vault. And he knew that it was subject to the Germans seizing it. This is his entire collection of his life's work. He wrote his son, and he said, his son Pierre in New York, and he said, "I know what efficient removal men the Germans can be." And he was right to be worried, because they showed up at the bank. And it was not Marguerite, his daughter, and it was not Amélie, his estranged wife, who arrived at the bank to help protect it. It was his rival, Pablo Picasso, who owned the other 2 vaults. One of the most interesting pieces of research when I was putting the book together was this event that happened in the spring of 1942. Matisse is recuperating in Nice. He can no longer really stand at the easel, so he can't paint for any length of time. And he's visited by a man named Louis Aragon, who is known to be very handsome and very dashing. Aragon was a surrealist poet. He was a veteran of the humiliated French army. He'd been evacuated at Dunkirk. But he came back to France. He was also a leader of the communist resistance. So he's got a really, really bad resume, considering the Gestapo. And he becomes on the Gestapo's hit list. In fact, he and his wife, Elsa Triolet, were briefly jailed, but they were using aliases. The Germans didn't quite catch up to it, and they were mistakenly released. But in early 1942, Louis Aragon, who is going to become known as the poet of the resistance, risks his life to go down to Nice to meet Henri Matisse, the great French painter, the great French modernist. What's this man like, this elderly man, this treasure of France who has defiantly remained? And very movingly, over a few months in 1942, Aragon gets to know Matisse. He has his notebooks out, and he's interviewing Matisse and talking to him and writing down what Matisse is saying and observing things. But Matisse, sitting down, has his sketchbook open and is sketching Aragon time and time again. Aragon finally says, it was me who was supposed to be learning your story, but it's you who's learning about me. But the younger poet of the resistance and the venerable French artist had a wonderful friendship that developed, and it was one that lasted the rest of each of their lives. In 1972, 30 years after these events, Aragon published a 2-volume work on Matisse, 850 pages long. And when he wrote about those days in 1942, those dangerous days in 1942, he had this to say: "The time had come to be aware of the national reality of Matisse, because he was of France, because he was France." In 1943, Matisse begins work on what is not only one of the greatest artworks of his World War II output, but one of the greatest artworks of his long career. It was meant to be a book of plates that were going to be made out of thick Canson paper that had been colored to the exacting standards of Matisse with bright colors. And then those thick sheets of paper would be cut by shears that Matisse knew how to use Because remember, his potato-colored city in the north of France was also a textile hub. So he knew how to use shears with the same exactitude that he wielded the pen and the brush, the pencil and the brush. So he starts to create these prototypes for these plates of brightly colored shapes backed on brightly colored paper. And when you see these up close, there's hundreds of pinholes, because he and Lydia, who's there in the picture, they would put them up on the wall and he would try and get the composition just right. So they're this way, there's upside down, there's sideways, there's backwards, and then finally he would be happy with the composition that would become the prototype. The name of this project, and this project was meant to be a book where you could take these plates out and you could fold it up and give it to a friend, or you could tape it to your wall in your office, or you could pin it to your wall in your home. It was meant to be democratic. It wasn't meant for collectors. And the name of it began with one name and wound up a second name, but the beginning and the ending name are both very similar. The first name was the circus, Le Cirque. And you might say, well, Matisse was nostalgic for maybe the circus. Maybe his bright colors came from seeing the circus when he was a boy. That may be true. But I think there's another reason for him using the circus as his thematic overlay. What is more at odds with the Übermensch, the Volksgemeinschaft, the racial, cultural, and ethnic purity that the Germans sought, than to elevate the marginalized people that make their lives under the circus tent? The sword swallowers, the elephants heartbreakingly balancing on a ball, the lion tamers, the outcasts, the marginalized. His jazz plates, the name that it became known as was jazz, but for similar reasons. Jazz was anathema to the Nazis. It was considered an American mongrel art form. Matisse was a tremendous lover of jazz and other things American, and so for some of the same reasons he winds up calling it jazz. But the plates run the gamut. There's 20 of them, and they run the gamut from, some of them are very pleasant to see with those organic shapes that a lot of us will close our eyes and think of Matisse. We think of those leaves and organic shapes that he was so famous for. But others of these images are latently violent. They're images of surveillance. They're images of powerlessness. The fall of Icarus, the toboggan. Remember, Matisse was not only really unable to walk because of his stomach ailment, but there's no petrol, there's no getting anywhere, there's no gasoline to be had, there's no real travel to be done. So there's a sense of being trapped, there's a sense of being watched, there's a sense of powerlessness. When they asked Matisse about the white elephant, he said, "The white elephant, c'est moi, it's me." And when they asked Lydia about the white elephant, she said, "White. Why is it white? White is the color of animals in captivity." So Matisse, again, is expressing his emotion through his line, through his color. Some of these were images of hope, perhaps most famously this one, which if you take Sword Swallower and you're Matisse and you're sitting up in bed and Lydia is bringing you these sheets of paper. And sometimes she puts them on the bed right side up or upside down or sideways. And Matisse, who would often take artworks and flip them upside down to see the strength of the line, does this with his own work. And he takes Sword Swallower perhaps and he flips it over and he says, that's interesting. What you get is a figure third from left, which commentators even in the 1940s said, wow, that looks like somebody. I can't quite put my finger on it. You have the defiant chin. You have the head cut off where it might be a cap or a kepi. And of course the Gallic nose, the profile of Charles de Gaulle. And then you have those gold circles on either side of this plate, which was called Monsieur Loyal, which is the French phrase for ringmaster. And the gold circles perhaps refer to the gold buttons on the general's uniform. It's as if Matisse is telegraphing to us that the circus is going to leave town and the Republic is going to come back. "1944 was a year of waiting and worrying while de Gaulle in London and the Allies in Great Britain planned the cross-channel invasion, Operation Overlord, Matisse stopped receiving letters from his daughter, Marguerite. She had been a consistent correspondent through the war. She at one point told him, "I will make myself useful," up in occupied Paris. In another instance, even before that, she said, "I would rather die with pistols in my hand than live under the German yoke." But she goes silent in 1944. Matisse doesn't hear from her. And he might worry, given these statements that she'd made to him before. She had, in fact, sent her son, Claude, to live in the United States for his own safety. But perhaps she did that for her as well, so she could make herself useful in occupied Paris. If Henri Matisse harbored suspicions that his daughter had joined the resistance, he was correct. Marguerite Matisse joined the French resistance as a courier. She couried information from Paris to Brittany and Normandy in advance of the Allied invasion. And in 1944, Matisse stops receiving letters from her and worries what's happened to her. His son Jean, the one who's not in New York, remained in France and, again, is all over the country. He's in occupied Paris at times, he's in Toulouse at times, he's down in Antibes at times. It turns out that Jean, his eldest son, who had been part of that humiliated army in World War II, the one that surrendered in 6 weeks, was helping British intelligence. So Jean, unbeknownst to Matisse perhaps, and his son, Matisse's grandson, they were taking a rowboat out in the dark Antibes night, lit only by the moon, to interface with the battery-powered sub that would bring on board British agents. And again, there's inklings that Matisse was worried about his son Jean. Maybe he knew more than he was letting on, but of course, you wouldn't let on if you knew that your two children were involved in the resistance. During these anxious moments in 1944, the Allies were preparing not only the assault on Normandy, which I think we all know from Saving Private Ryan, D-Day, but there was another cross-water assault, amphibious assault, and it was meant to be in Provence, in southern France, and it was called Operation Dragoon, and the preparations were being made. Critics of Matisse, the ones who said, and maybe even still say, he took the easy way out. He went down to Nice. He wasn't brave enough to stay in occupied Paris like Picasso. He went down where the living was good and the palm trees were swaying in the breeze. He knew that not only was Italy going to invade, which Italy did invade and took over, had jurisdiction over Nice for a while, but he also knew that, once the Americans land on North Africa, it's going to be Sicily and it's going to be Italy. And everybody knew this. There's going to be a southern theater of war, and Nice is right sort of in that zone. It's 30 miles from the Italian border. There are rail lines and automobile routes and aqueducts that needed to be bombed, not by the Germans or the Italians, but needed to be bombed by the Allies. And so the Allies begin bombing Nice, British and American bombers. In one single day, 500 Niçois were killed by Allied bombs. So much so that the school children and the elderly had to be evacuated from the city, including Henri Matisse. So Matisse and Lydia take a villa, if you can call it shabby. It wasn't super nice, but it's a villa, 10 miles up in the hills outside of Nice, and that's where Matisse will spend the remaining years of the war. I would also note that one of the plates for jazz or the circus was this one here, which Matisse called Le Cowboy. His country had been saved by the doughboys in the First World War, or mostly saved, or helped at least achieve victory in the First World War, helped save Paris. He had been to America on occasions. His son lived in the United States. His grandson, Claude, was living in the United States. I don't know if by making the plate cowboy was a comment on the Allies that were coming to liberate France a second time, but I've just put it up there so you can have a look, the cowboy. In May of 1944, just weeks before D-Day, Matisse got the terrible news. His daughter had been denounced. We don't know by whom. but she had been given up by someone traitorous, and she had been arrested. She was arrested by the Gestapo, and she was imprisoned in a Gestapo prison in Rennes in Brittany. She was a 50-year-old woman. She was the daughter of this world-famous artist, and that didn't stop the Germans from doing their dirty work. Matisse didn't know where she was, didn't know if she were alive, in fact. But she was in Rennes at the Gestapo prison. His wife, Amélie, in her mid-70s, in occupied Paris, had been typing up on her Hermès typewriter instructions for the communist underground on how to use the Sten submachine gun. She was separately arrested, and she was sent to a prison outside of Paris. So Matisse was able to track her down, find out that she was still alive. She was in prison. I think she wound up spending twice as long in prison as she was supposed to at first. But it was a terrible, terrible shock. And this is the third war. When we think of Matisse, we think of the evergreen. We think of the vibrancy. We think of the joy that it brings us to stand in front of his artwork, which it does. Maybe I'm biased, but I think more so than any other artist. When I stand in front of a Matisse in Nice or in New York or in Chicago, there's just something about his artwork that you just have to silently stand before it and take it in. There's something transcendent maybe about it, or certainly evergreen. But also, he was not above the three wars that he lived through, the First World War and the Second World War. When he was old enough to translate his emotions through his art. Look at this plate from 1944 when he finds out his daughter has been arrested. The wolf. It has all the color that we would want in Matisse, the fuchsia, the orange stripe, the blue. But it is a latently violent image. Lydia said, it's the beast with the bloodstained eye. And the late curator in New York, Reva Castleman, said, the wolf, that was a stand-in for the Gestapo. Because the wolf had Matisse's daughter in its jaws. Folks, thank you for coming. I hope I've saved time for Q&A.
Thank you, Christopher. If we have any questions, just raise your hand. I'll come to you with the mic.
I'm a former history teacher, so I'm used to hands up in the air. So please, I got one up here. We have a taker.
Oh, you have one up here. Okay, sorry.
In the first painting that you showed with the son at the piano, in the lower left-hand corner was a woman. Could you tell us about that?
It's meant to be a piano teacher, the woman on the high stool.
That's such a beautiful painting.
Oh, yes, yes. That could be...
it looks like a sculpture.
He used, I think many of you will know, Matisse had a collection of props that he used time and time again in his art. And a lot of them are at the Musée Matisse in Nice. The chairs, the vases, the textiles that he would hang, they appear time and time again. And my guess would be that is a sculpture that was part of that prop. Other questions? I see some hands maybe over here.
There's some hands up here, up
we
front.
got hands. Ask away.
Okay.
This is a very embarrassing question, but I'm curious about Lydia and the relationship, and I assume it was more than muse and model, or no? You said they were friends.
There's a split of authority. Hilary Sperling, who wrote the big two-volume bio on Matisse, came out around the 95 and 2005. She said, nothing happened between the two. Lydia always referred to him in the formal vous, not tu, and he was the patron, he was the boss, and apparently she used that language. That was a real thing. Like, she didn't make that up. He had abdominal, he wore a belt. He had abdominal surgery, which was very serious. There are other scholars that they say, there was something. She was a Siberian beauty, a white-haired blonde Siberian beauty that was very arresting for him. And there's one incident where Picasso and his companion Francois Gillot come to visit, and he's kind of teasing her. There's like a curtain, and he's like saying cuckoo, cuckoo. They're playing hide and seek. So, kind of make of that what you will. But the family, they didn't really respect what was going on with Lydia. They didn't really respect Lydia's position as the studio manager of Matisse from literally, the late 1930s until he dies in 1954. When he died in 1954, she kind of took her bag and left, and said, when I die, I want to be buried with a shirt of Matisse's. And that was it, very simply. But it was a difficult thing for the three children to have their father, essentially living with this woman who's much younger, and so.
I was an art history and fine arts major in college, and I have to say this was one of the finest art history lectures that I ever attended.
Wow.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you. Okay, we have another one back here.
I had to do my research to make it so I appreciate those kind words.
When he moved to the villa, was that in Saint Paul de Vence where he designed the chapel?
It's in Vence, so there's a Vence and there's a Saint Paul de Vence, which is I don't want to compare the two villages, but maybe Saint Paul is more known to American visitors. I don't know, but Vence is the village where he took the villa, and right across the street from that villa was a Dominican convent in terrible shape. It was a leaky garage, essentially. It was a leaking garage where these Dominican nuns were doing their thing. And this is just a crazy coincidental story, but in 1942, Lydia put an ad in the papers in Nice for a night nurse because he also suffered from insomnia. So they were looking for someone who could come in and read to him and try and get him to go to sleep. And this woman answered the ad. Her name was Monique Bourgeois, and she was desperately poor. Family didn't have anything. Desperately poor. Her father had been grievously wounded in the First World War, was thereafter unable to work and provide for his family. So she takes this job, and she is caring for Matisse in 1942. And at some point, she says to him, I've decided to join the convent. And he was angry with her because he had used her as a model. She'd been a model in these beautiful 4 paintings that he'd done where he had transformed Monique Bourgeois, this very modest French woman. One of the paintings is called The Idol. She'd never worn couture before. She'd never worn jewels before. And there's Monique Bourgeois transformed, her head held proudly up and erect. And they made peace. And they made peace serendipitously in 1947 when she brought to him, because she had been reassigned to that same convent across the street from his villa, if you can believe it. She was reassigned there, and she drew a sketch of a stained glass window, and she went to him and said, Monsieur, would you please consider drawing us a stained glass window because we were working out of this leaky garage? And he said, I'll do you one better. I will design, I will help fund, I will build, and I will decorate with my paintings, with my stained glass, your chapel. And that's what he spent the next 4 or 5 years doing. And it is transcendent to be in that space, as many of you will know if you've been there.
I think we have time for one more. And after this question, I invite you all to visit the Elm Street Books table where Christopher will be signing copies of Matisse at War.
This may be a little offbeat, but we mentioned he had trained as a lawyer. Was it also the case that Kandinsky had trained as a lawyer? Did they meet? Do you know if they became friends?
The first part of your question, sir?
With Matisse having trained initially as a lawyer, did he ever encounter Kandinsky, who came to Paris about that same time and also, I believe, had a background in law?
I don't know I don't know. His lawyer training was lawyer paralegal, I don't know exactly what the French phrase would be for that, but His law career was short-lived. The reason I bring it up, though, is he came from a family in the North that believed in the ideals of France. The equality, fraternity, brotherhood, and he married a woman that also shared those values. So the two, as a couple, was not a divided household politically. And I will also say, when you talk about Kandinsky, and someone like Paul Klee, Matisse he knew these players. In many cases, he knew them personally, but he certainly knew their work. And he was able always to respect the German artist like a person like Klee. At the same time, really, really, hating the soldiers that were, in control of his hometown and his adopted city of Nice, if that makes sense. He was able to sort of bifurcate his feelings on art and in politics. Do we have time for one more?
Christopher, okay, one more.
If there's other art historians out there who would like to compliment me, I'll take those too.
I'm not an art historian, but I am staring at this photograph and just wonder if you'd say a few words about that. Where is he? What's he doing? What are those numbers?
This is the chapel in Vence. I don't think it's not quite finished yet, and it probably doesn't do it justice, actually. But it's a very frank and candid picture, probably from my guess would be 51. The stained glass windows are his design and his exact in color. The Stations of the Cross is what you're looking at. And it was criticized at the time by some. He used paint on tile, and then the tiles were fired, and the tiles were then put up on the Stations of the Cross. And it's not to everybody's taste. It's a very very different Stations of the Cross than a lot of people are used to at their maybe older church. But the overall effect of being in that space is, like I said, it's irrespective of how religious you are or are not, it is a transcendent place to be. The light is, if you think about what Matisse was always trying to do with his color and then put yourself in his dream world of color in 3 dimensions, is quite an experience. So I would urge you, not that you need extra reason to go to the south of France, but if you have an opportunity, I would do that.
Christopher, one last thing. You also are a lawyer, correct?
That is correct.
You're
yes.
a lawyer. So how do you have time for all of, this is a lot of research, and this is your second book, and you seem to find material in places that are pretty well worn. I mean, the Second World War, a lot has been said. So how do you reconcile these two parts of?
Well, I still have my license, and from time to time I get called in to do smaller things. But in all honesty, I don't do a lot of practicing law. I'm more or less working on my writing. But I would not be a writer. I would not be up here if I hadn't learned the research chops in law school and then practicing. You really have to be good at research, and you have to be good at writing, or you have to get good at writing, I guess would be the way I would say it. You have to become a good writer, more so than my college. I was an English major and history major in college, English minor, history major, much more so than that. It was the law school and practicing law that turned me into a reasonably good writer, and then you just do it every day and you get better and better. But those skills really, really helped, and teaching high school was... that's where I got I think the storytelling part, because you have students at 7:35 in the morning looking at you, and you're like, oh, what can I do? I have to tell a story to get them engaged. So I got better.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you for being here, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight.
Thank you.